1 month on and no let-up in Iraq's unprecedented anti-government protests. In fact, those protests may be entering a new phase. At least 5 killed as security forces fired live rounds this Monday on demonstrators in the capital. Demonstrators who were marching in the area near state television. Now, they say, is not the time to be airing nature documentaries when the country is up in arms. They're sick of the whole system, they say, with its sectarian power sharing enshrined in the Constitution after the 2003 US-led invasion that toppled Saddam Hussein. That Constitution, a nice idea on paper, say critics, but it has the effect of freeing from accountability those who've mismanaged Reconstruction and the nation's vast oil wealth. Demonstrators want electoral reform. Can they get it? Who's in favor of keeping the status quo? This Monday, protesters attacked the Iranian consulate in Karbala. Iran denounces foreign meddling and the manipulation of the protesters. Does the current movement pose a threat to Tehran? Like with Lebanon, where does it leave the Iranian regime's narrative of siding with the downtrodden? Today in the France 24 debate, we're wondering, is Iraq ripe for revolution? Joining us from Baghdad, France 24 correspondent Simona Fulton. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Omar Mohammed is the founder of Mosul Eye. Welcome back.
Thank you.
From Washington, Iraqi journalist and academic Rafid Jabouri, thank you for being with us.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
And from Berlin, Borzu Daragahi, international correspondent for The Independent. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter. Hashtag F24debate. Yeah, it was earlier in the heart of Baghdad. A Reuters camera crew followed demonstrators and the tuk-tuks, which have been serving as makeshift ambulances.
They're killing young people to please Iran and its militias. We're the ones who fought ISIS. I gave up 2 martyrs. One of them died in battle, and the other just yesterday in front of the Iranian consulate. ISIS is in the past, and we'll keep sending martyrs for the sake of Iraq. Our next battle will be with Iran.
Okay, that was not from Baghdad. That was from Karbala earlier, after there was that shooting there. Perhaps we can go to those images from Baghdad. All right, we'll try to go to those later. Simona Fulton, what can we piece together on what exactly has happened today in the Iraqi capital?
Well, the protesters attempted to control and cross a third bridge across the River Tigris. They have already set up barricades on 2 major bridges which lead from the eastern side of the river across to the western side where many government offices are located. And it appears that today they tried to do the same thing on the Ahrar bridge, which is very close to the other 2 bridges. And that's when security forces responded using live ammunition as well as tear gas and stun grenade to prevent the protesters from crossing. Now it appears that they managed to cross for a couple of hours. They reached the railway station on the western side of the river, which is very close to one of the locations of the Prime Minister's office that is located outside of the fortified green zone. And I could hear from my location sustained gunfire for about an hour until security forces pushed the protesters back across the bridge, back in direction of Tahrir Square, which has been the epicenter of these demonstrations in Baghdad. And of course, the use of live ammunition is something quite significant because we haven't seen that used since the onset of the second wave of protests on October 25th. So that is something that is likely to ignite further anger and that could lead to further escalation tonight.
Yeah, the scenes were again startling earlier in the Iraqi capital. Again, a Reuters camera crew able to film images close to the where state television is in the heart of Baghdad. Omar Mohammed, your reaction to those images?
Just to state some facts here, the number of the people who were killed since 1st of October by the Iraq security forces has exceeded, according to the government itself, more than 250 were killed and more than 8,000 injured. We know that the number is higher than this. More than 400 have been killed. And just today, 5 of them were killed. The government has exceeded its use of violence against the people in the streets, those who were asking for legitimate demands. The important thing is to know why they are protesting. And it seems that the government doesn't know or doesn't care about what they are protesting. Those people who were labeled by the government as ignorant, who have no education, they don't know what they are calling for, is completely not true. Those people, those young people, after they had free access to the information after 2003, they have set up many initiatives in the country. They have access to information, access to knowledge. They found themselves, after 16 years of failing state, that they are living in hell. They decided that this is enough for them, and they have to change the whole system. They are not just demonstrating against the current government. They are demonstrating against the whole system because it's a failing system.
And we saw in those images the police fire or we don't know, security forces.
The government doesn't know who is firing. This is what the government is saying.
Right. Fires those live rounds. We saw the tuk-tuks, the ambulances, acting as makeshift ambulances, taking the wounded away. And then people come back.
The people, after the government used this violence against them, they decided that there is no way back. No matter how much the government kills of them, they have decided that this is the end. And they are no more afraid of this violence because this generation, my generation, and all of these generations lived in Iraq. We were born during the war. We lived during another war. And we simply lived our whole life living in violence. So they don't care. The government is, unfortunately, the government thinks that using the violence will stop them, but unfortunately, it will not. They will continue until their demands are met.
Rafi Jabouri, have we entered a new phase?
It seems to be like that, especially with the second wave of the protest that started on the 25th. Because, the first wave, as we all know, started on the 1st of October, and then it was repressed by the government. Many people were killed. I myself was amazed by the energy and the scale of the protest when it was relaunched on the 25th. With all what we have seen so far, with the sentiment of people like Omar talking about what they feel and how they feel about the situation, I think that it's very hard to imagine that this will end without a real fundamental concession from the ruling class in Baghdad. I think there will be some significant change in the political system, not necessarily toppling the whole political system, because this whole Iraqi regime is supported by both Iran and the United States. These are the most powerful states that have influence in Iraq. So it's too early to talk about toppling the whole regime, although anything is possible
because they're
in
talking
such circumstances. But
I was going to say they're talking about they want electoral reform. Does that mean the end to sort of the sectarian power sharing that's in the Constitution currently?
Well, that's their aspiration. That's what they want to achieve. But we in a situation like what we see in Iraq, you will be hearing many things, many demands. What that demand means is that they want to change, for example, the makeup of the Iraqi parliament, the performance of the political class, better public services, which were, of course, at the heart of the roots of this protest movement, less corruption or real anti-corruption policies from the government, which they haven't seen for years, despite the broken promises. So, we see demands, we see energy, but again, there are also forces that are worried about what's happening. We have talked about Iran. We mentioned Iran. Of course, Iran's allies in Baghdad, particularly the Shia militias, but also many in the Shia political class. I'm sure that they are planning something to deal with this phase of the protest movement, because what they have done so far failed. Their first reaction to use violence against the protesters in the first week of October and demonizing them as in claiming that they were agents of the United States and Israel did not work. We see more support for the protest movement because, we don't only talk about those dozens of thousands who are protesting in Baghdad and in Karbala, but it's very clear that they enjoy the support of the wider community, of the wider Iraqi society as well. So, we have entered a new phase in this protest movement, and I am thinking about the plans of Iran and its allies to deal with this stage.
Yeah, as Rafi Jabouri is saying, it's not just Baghdad. Iraq's second city, Basra, has been protesting. So have many cities of the majority Shia south, like Karbala, where medical authorities report 4 killed when demonstrators tried to scale the wall of the Iranian embassy there, the Iranian consulate, excuse me. Borzu Daragahi, when you think back to everything that Iraq's been through in 16 years, the fall of Saddam Hussein, civil war, the surge, the invasion of vast swathes of the country by ISIS militants, all that seems like ancient history today now.
Well, it's not ancient history, and I think a lot of it still colors the trauma of those events, still colors the actions of the government and the protesters as well. There's a real fragility there when it comes to Iraq, and that has many people concerned who are not the United States or Iran or even part of the ruling elite in Iraq, is how will Iraq weather some kind of big systemic change. This is a country that's barely hanging on after losing a massive swath of the country to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and his ISIS jihadis. So there's a lot of concern there, and rightful concern even on the part of Iraqis. I think that the failures of the Iraqi political class have been criticized by many people in the past. There have been other protest movements. The secular Iraqis have protested, have tried to organize against what they saw as the incompetence and corruption of the ruling class that emerged after the 2003 U.S. invasion. Sunnis rose up along with other Arabs in other parts of the region during the Arab Spring uprising and afterward. And this time, a real threat to the system. It's mostly, if you look at the addresses of where people are rising up, these are predominantly Shia areas. Real threat to the ruling establishment, as well as, and this is where the geopolitics comes in. When you have an uprising in Karbala and you have people in the Shia parts of Iraq rising up, there's a lot of kind of organic and other types of connections to Iran. So I think those people in Iran, the leadership in Iran, is rather nervous that this virus could spread.
Karbala, Simona Fulton, is of course where there was the original battle that created the schism in Islam between Sunnis and Shias. Is there the sense that right now it's a problem among Shias, or are we also seeing protests in places like the Sunni areas, like the majority Kurdish areas of the north?
Well, right now the protests are focused very much in the Shia itself. As was already said, it's basically an uprising of the Shia masses against the Shiite political and, interestingly, religious establishment. Even religious figures who are deeply revered, such as Ali Sistani, have not been spared any criticism. Now, with regard to the north, I mean, we have not seen protests in the Sunni north, but that's not because people don't sympathize. And I think Omar will be able to speak more to that. But it's basically because people in those areas have been most affected by the battle against ISIS. Their areas have been destroyed. They're struggling with a lot of other issues that might be preventing them from taking to the streets. Similarly, in Kurdistan, it's not that people don't sympathize, but the Kurdish authorities themselves have been very repressive towards any kind of uprising in their area. So it's not because they don't identify with the demands. I think they do. And we have actually, interestingly, seen some people travel to Baghdad. For example, there was a convoy from Fallujah, from the Sunni province of Anbar, that came to participate in the protest. So we're seeing some participation of different sects, of different religious groups. I saw the other day on Tahrir Square a group of Christians who were also protesting. It's more about whether the specific regional circumstances in the Sunni north and in Kurdistan allow people to really take part and rise up.
Have you, Omar Mohammed, do you have news from Mosul the last couple of weeks?
Yeah, I think before speaking about Mosul and why Mosul is actually not protesting, which is actually already protesting, but in a different way. I have to disagree with what my colleagues said about labeling the current protest as a Shia protest against a Shia prominent government. Actually, part of the protest is against this narrative that has been imposed on the country for more than 16 years, that everything is happening in the country is either Shia or Sunni or Kurd. Those people on the ground, those people on the streets of Baghdad and Karbala and the other cities of Iraq, they do not identify themselves with these identities. They do identify themselves with one thing, that they are all Iraqis. And I also disagree that the protest, for example, on the streets of Baghdad is identified by sectarian identities. You can see the images coming from them, you can see the language of them, you can see all the signs they are using. They are nothing but Iraqis. They are opposing what the government, the narrative of the government that have been imposed on the people. Because the government was always justifying itself by sectarianism. The people said, we cannot...
We're beyond that now. We've taken a very quick break. We'll be right back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're wondering if it's not a turning point for those protests in Iraq, which are challenging the sectarian power-sharing constitution of 2005 that was written after the fall of Saddam Hussein. With us to talk about it, our Baghdad correspondent Simona Fulton. Also joining us is Omar Mohammed, the founder of Mosul Eye. From Washington, D.C., we're with Rafid Jabouri, a journalist and academic, and from Berlin, Borzu Dargahi, who is the international correspondent for the independent newspaper. Forget Cairo. Baghdad's got its own Tahrir Square. Simona Fulton went there and sent this report.
Baghdad's Tahrir Square has become a little state of its own, a state where no one person is in charge, but one where everything is nonetheless provided. Dozens of tents have popped up over the past few days, offering medical care, legal advice, supplies, food, or a place to rest, all of it free of charge.
It's all from people. When I call my friends and tell them I need some support, it comes. Despite all the state resources, the government doesn't have what we have.
Everyone chips in. Protesters clean the streets, manage checkpoints, and even offer free haircuts. Dozens man the barricades on the front lines with security forces, while others rest to gather strength for the turbulent night ahead. Tuk-tuks serve as ambulances, ferrying injured protesters from the front lines.
There are few ambulances because we don't have a government. We want to be the government. There is no government at all. There's no system. They only know how to steal.
Students offer free medical care, risking penalties for skipping class.
It's a sacrifice. The people, the homeland, and Iraq are more important than my classes. If I lose a year or two, I can repeat it. But if these people die, how can we get them back?
Demonstrators say they want a government that embodies the same principles of service and sacrifice.
The government are a bunch of thieves. They should come here and learn from the people. We want a government that comes from this square, from the people.
Borzu Dargahi, we're into those heady days right now where everything seems possible to those protesters. You covered events at that other Tahrir Square back in 2011 and such. What is the future is unwritten, but still, what can we expect in Baghdad?
I think that's a really important question. One of the mistakes that the people in the 2011 Arab Spring uprisings made, they focused too much on personalities. Get rid of Hosni Mubarak, get rid of Zain al-Abidin Ben Ali, get rid of Yemen's Saleh, and worry about what comes next later. They were unorganized, and they didn't have a lot of leadership in their ranks. And I think that the lessons have been taken to heart by this latest wave of uprisings throughout the Middle East. In Sudan, in Algeria, in Lebanon, as well as in Iraq, there's not just a focus on getting rid of one guy. Even in, for example, in Sudan and Lebanon and Algeria, they got rid of that one guy, and they're still out in the streets demanding systemic change. So I think that's one lesson learned. But I think one lesson that hasn't been learned is the part about organization. If one looks at Sudan, Sudan is having a relatively successful transition toward democracy. Let's see what happens. But one key factor there was this association of doctors, lawyers, and engineers that took the leadership role in the protests and made connections with Western and international partners and got their support for the transition that's undergoing there. Whereas in other countries like Algeria, Lebanon, Iraq, there's no such entity. And so the ruling elite feels content just sitting on its laurels, kicking back. In the case of Algeria and Iraq, they have all the oil money. It's all still under their control. They're somewhat even impervious to any other kind of pressure other than an oil strike, which doesn't appear to be happening in either country. So, there's a tough lesson about to be coming up for these countries, including Iraq, as to how you take that spirit of the street and turn it into real political change, take that momentum and put it into reality.
Rafi Jabouri, how can Iraq be more like Sudan and have civic leaders that organize themselves, that bring in together in a big tent fashion all those who are ready to move on to the next step?
The answer is we don't know. That's not going to be easy. We have seen Iraq at the focus of international attention, at the focus of American attention after the 2003 invasion, where the building of democracy was celebrated and promoted and encouraged, but we haven't seen that type of leadership, that type of organization, although it was reported many, many times in the media that, Iraq has actually passed sectarianism, passed the old ways of doing politics, but it actually has not until this moment where we are looking at something that is very promising and might be really genuine. How is this going to be evolved into political representation, new form of political representation and organization? I don't know how is that going to happen, but I know very well that it's not going to be easy. We are now at the middle of an uprising and probably even a revolution. Sentiments are so high, and it will take time for the political conclusion of this to appear. But before I forget, I just wanted to say something about the sectarian factor, because you mentioned that and then we went to the break. The main reason why Sunnis, because you were asking about, the Sunni participation or the Sunni not participating in this, the short answer to that is that because they are intimidated after, the uprising or the protest movement in the predominantly Sunni areas in Western Iraq in 2012, 2013. The government, the Iraqi former government of Prime Minister Nur al-Maliki succeeded in two things: in repression of those protests in the Sunni areas, but also in demonizing them in the eyes of the Shia majority. And of course, after that came the catastrophe of the Islamic State, which took over right after the protest in those areas. Now we see a Sunni support, of course, and Sunni participation in Baghdad, which is mixed populated, although Shia areas, Shia neighborhoods are more active in the protest than, or as opposed to, in comparison with the Sunni neighborhoods. But of course, the majority of the protests are taking place in the Shia provinces of Iraq, but under nationalist slogans and principles.
Simona Fulton, this issue of how you go from a leaderless protest movement to something that can coalesce into an active force for reform, was that something people on Tahrir Square had ideas about?
Well, first of all, I want to respond to Omar, who completely misrepresented or perhaps misunderstood what I had said earlier. The fact that you have a predominantly Shiite population rising up against the Shiite political establishment is precisely proof that this movement is anti-sectarian. Basically, their message is, you cannot count on our loyalty just because we're Shia. You can no longer divide us along sectarian lines. So there is no contradiction between saying that it's predominantly Shia people rising up against the Shiite government and the fact, which is true, that this is absolutely a nationalist and non-sectarian movement. Now, with regard to actually translating this movement into political action, there are no real leaders of this protest movement. In over a month of covering it, it appears that it's a grassroots movement. It's people who are angry, and they have not been able to really come up with a leadership to really represent them. And what is difficult is that they are completely rejecting the entire political establishment. They don't just want the government to resign. They want all of the parties to leave. So there is not one entity, one political entity, in whatever form it may be, that they trust. And it's very difficult to see how this can be taken forward, how the protesters can actually voice their demands in a joint way, how they can put forth leadership, how they can actually take this forward in a constitutional way to actually put some of their demands into reality.
So does that mean that, as Borzu was suggesting, that the leadership in Iraq can just sort of sit this out?
Unfortunately, I think that's exactly what they're trying to do. We are seeing multiple statements come out of the Green Zone from be it the president or the prime minister. They're basically just trying to placate the protesters, suggesting different reforms which are not really addressing the root cause of this crisis. We saw the president come out last week and say that he's prepared to call for early elections and that the prime minister is prepared to step down. But then we have not seen really any action on that. So they're very much just waiting it out. They're hoping that people will just run out of steam and eventually go back to living their lives as they lived them before.
All right, we mentioned it in part one of our discussion, and that is how nervous neighboring Iran is over all this. During Friday prayers, Iraq's top Shia spiritual leader, Ayatollah Ali Sistani, had a message read out that, while it did not mention the United States or Iran by name, seemed clear to all.
We do not allow any force, whether external or internal, to talk on behalf of the Iraqi people.
Now that followed a different kind of message from Tehran last week, the supreme leader who denounced the street protests in both Iraq and Lebanon.
The perpetrators of this wickedness are known to the world. Today, the arrogant powers, America and Western intelligence services, backed by funding from some backward countries in the region, are spreading chaos in our neighboring countries and countries close to us in this region. They are undermining our security. This is the worst kind of hostility and the most dangerous and spiteful behavior against a country.
Your reaction, Omar Mohammed?
I think what's happening, or what we are witnessing in Iraq, is a revolution that is going to change the whole game in Middle East, at least in Iraq and the region around Iraq. This kind
so it
of
is a
protest,
threat to Iran.
It is absolutely a threat to Iran, and this is what the protesters are stating in their words, their own words, and their actions. It's a protest against the Iranian influence in Iraq that controlled Iraq since 2003. Iraqi government since 2003 have been completely dominated by Iran. Iran has the power in the country. Iran is ruling the political elites. Iran has its own proxies in Iraq. Iran has used Iraq for its own regional wars. So this is indeed a protest not just against the Iranian influence, but any Iranian ambition in Iraq to keep the power in the country. This is a revolution that is going to reform the whole intellectual and political system in Iraq. Whether the political scientists accept or not to call it a revolution, it is a revolution. It doesn't need to be organized by philosophers or whatever. Revolutions have always been organized by such people. Those people have their own lives, they have their own dreams, they believe in the future, and it's completely different now. Those generations we are witnessing in Iraq are completely disconnected from the discourse of the governments of Iraq. They don't believe in the sectarian system. They don't believe even in the imported democracy to Iraq. They are creating their own democracy. This is what we are witnessing now. That's why I am so, although there is a huge violence against them, but what we will see in the few coming days, it will amaze everyone.
It will amaze everyone, you say. Let me ask you, Borzu Daragahi, at this point in time, what's a bigger threat, if you will, for Iran? Is it the sanctions by the U.S., the pressure by the likes of Israel, or is it street protests in places like Baghdad and Beirut?
This is a far bigger threat in terms of inspiration to ruling regimes all over the region. But I just want to say this is Iran as well as the Gulf, and you notice that all these other countries, all these Arab countries that are hostile to Iran, even though there's an anti-Iran tone to the protests, they are not, wholeheartedly backing this because they realize this virus could spread to their own tyrannies as well. So this is definitely a threat. The thing is, though, with this sort of that I've learned, the sort of hard way covering these kinds of uprisings for, like 9 years now, 10 years if you count the fact that I was in Iran when that uprising happened in 2009, the uprising in Tehran. When there is no address for the opposition, it gives the regime real advantages, but it also gives the other countries that have interests in your country. Let's say Iraq is not just Iran that has an interest in Iraq. Turkey has an interest. The United States has a huge interest in Iraq. It makes them nervous about these protests, and it makes them wonder what it's about and whether it's just going to lead to more chaos, if it's just going to lead to an escalating cycle of chaos.
I was going to say, Borzu, on that point, this past Sunday, you had images of the Iraqi Prime Minister, Adel Abdul Mahdi, hosting a delegation from the U.S. Congress, headed by the chair of the House Armed Services Committee, Adam Smith. What do you make of those images?
I mean, you can make your own conclusion. I think the picture speaks a lot. The United States is concerned. The United States is worried. They do not want Iraq to fall into chaos. And as long as you have this sort of leaderless, amorphous opposition that doesn't have an address, that can't go fly someone to London and assure London, look, no, we're adults. If we take over, we'll be adults. Can't fly to Tehran, can't fly to Riyadh and say, look, this is us. We're the opposition. We represent the opposition. We're going to handle things with care. And we're, responsible adults. We're not just a bunch of people out in the streets and so on, that we have a real leadership, that we have deep leadership. As long as you don't have that, it's not just Iran that's going to try to sabotage your uprising, but every single other country in the region as well. And even the superpowers will not allow a country like Iraq to go into the unknown.
Rafi Jabouri, you agree?
Well, I agree with most of that, but I have to say that it's a big challenge for this protest movement to really select, produce a real leadership to that extent, an extent that would convince the West, the United States in particular, that it's safe or it's able to lead some kind of safe transition. But at the same time, what the protesters believe, they believe that the whole political class of theirs was actually invented by the U.S. after the 2003. That's their, they think that those people own their survivor, their emergence on the political scene to the United States, which actually established this whole system. So of course, Iran is at the center of the anger, but the United States is not a complete party to celebrate for those protesters. They are also disappointed with the U.S. and the way it has been dealing with their movement. Although, the U.S. Has sent a few clear messages to the Iraqi government to listen to the protesters, but it's also still supporting the Iraqi regime, which those protesters are aiming to shake, if not to topple as a whole. Again, it's too early to kind of use logic to analyze the outcome of this movement. It's still ongoing, and we don't know where it's going to lead eventually.
Simona Fulton, what's the next step?
Well, the president has promised that he will present to Parliament a new elections law and that he will call for fresh elections under that new election law. So it remains to be seen whether this will actually happen. But of course, the Parliament has been extremely dysfunctional over the past few weeks, a lot of times not even being able to meet quorum in order to discuss some of the reforms that have been proposed by the executive. And then even bigger question is, why would the political parties who are incumbent right now, who are basically in power, vote on an election law that would reduce their powers in any way? So the problem is here that basically if you want to take the constitutional route, which of course everybody in government wants, it will basically be extremely difficult to get rid of the power dynamics that are currently in place. And that is very much what the protesters want. I would be very surprised if we saw a complete overhaul of the electoral law that would basically put the major parties out of power. And that is exactly what the protesters are waiting for. For now, I think we have to wait and see what happens in Parliament this and coming week. But for now, it appears that the government will not be able to really propose and implement measures that are drastic enough for the protesters to really step back.
All right, so the standoff to continue for now. Omar Mohammed, very briefly, a word on where you see it going next.
Yeah, I think it's too early to expect any outcomes of this movement of protest in Iraq. We'll have to wait and see. They will form their own selves. There will be other factors will jump in. As they said, it's not just alarming for Iran, it's alarming for everyone. I think in the next few weeks, we will see something different.
All right. Omar Mohammed, I want to thank you. I want to thank Simona Fulton for your reporting from Baghdad, Borzu Daragahi, who joins us from Berlin, Rafi Jabouri in Washington. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to Emma James.
Hi there. Yes, been taking a look at how this one is playing out on social media and in the media too. One image that comes up again and again is that this is very much a youth protest, an idea encapsulated here by the cartoonist Emad Hajjaj, who has portrayed the Prime Minister, Adel Abdul Mahdi, as Pinocchio. And you see a young, strong protester there removing his head by grabbing hold of his elongated nose because, of course, they believe him to be telling them untruths. Now, while these protesters may be strong, they are certainly not indestructible. More than 250 have been killed since these protests began on the 1st of October. More than 5,500 have been injured, and the images do keep on coming, and it is worth being aware that if you look at under the hashtags, there are some very distressing videos in particular that are unfortunately available on social media. It is a revolution of youth, and perhaps for that very reason, it's also a revolution where we are seeing far more women taking part than you might have ever expected. Traditions really being thrust aside, women taking a very prominent role, lots and lots of images of them out on the streets, adding their artwork to the streets, but also taking part in those demonstrations too. That's an issue that's been addressed in The National by Pesha Majid, who says it's women of all ages, not just young. They are women of different generations taking part, ignoring the danger and the norms, of course, of Iraqi society. And she says that far from being put off by the fact that protesters are being killed, that's actually galvanizing them because they feel they can't be left out and they want to take part and show their anger at this. Now, one protester describes how ordinarily it's normal for women to sit at home crying while watching the television as all this unfolds. Not this time, though. They say that if they are not out on the streets, they're actually standing in the doorways holding an Iraqi flag to show their support, because they say it's essential for all parts of Iraqi society to show they back this movement if it is going to be successful in the end. There are plenty of fears, though, for women and for protesters on the whole, but the hashtag Free Saba, summing it up, this is a woman who was kidnapped on the weekend by an armed group. We're not sure exactly who has taken her. She was out in the streets actually trying to help give medical help to protesters who'd been injured, and nothing has been heard of her for quite some time.
Omar Mohammed, a word on this hashtag Free Saba?
Saba was kidnapped when she was going back home. She was volunteering to give medical assistance. We still don't know where is she, but some protesters and activists on the ground have provided some information. The government is still didn't address the kidnapping of Saba, and we hope that everyone can help in bringing back Saba to her family. Her mother is dying because this daughter has disappeared. We don't know anything.
It really does bring to life the sort of the human side of what's happening here, and you can see the numbers, but this is an individual who is clearly affected, and also this person pointing out that even though there's the risk of death, frankly, one of the most dangerous things you can do is threaten people who have no hope. These people have nothing to lose, says this gentleman, Nabil Salih. You just can't expect those who've lost a family member or friend to remain silent. The government response is only pushing more people onto the streets. The crackdown is backfiring. So basically, by killing people, they are ensuring that the movement keeps on growing. It's interesting to note as well that people on social media who are voicing their support for these protests, some of them are finding themselves being harassed by authorities, some of them being detained too. Human Rights Watch talking about this one, saying that people in the Anbar province, where there aren't currently any protests going on, some have been arrested just for voicing their support. In fact, one person was actually allegedly beaten and accused of inciting protest just for putting a frame around his Facebook profile photograph. So that's what Human Rights Watch is calling a completely inappropriate response, fairly understandably. Now, we always say with protests in the West how wonderful and witty our signs are and our banners that we hold up. This one is absolutely heartbreakingly poetic. We are a generation, it says, born in your wars, spent our childhood in your terrorism, our adolescence in your sectarianism, and our youth in your corruption. We are the generation of stolen dreams and premature aging.
All right, many thanks for that, Emma. James will continue to follow. I want to thank our panel once again.
Thank you. Just a last word, and what she said brought us back to why Mosul is not protesting. Actually, the schools and activists, they were receiving direct threats from militias that if you protest, this time we will not only kill you, but we will kill your families as well. That's why the people are moving from Mosul to Baghdad to join the protest. Let's hope that this wave of violence will bring, at the end, peace for Iraq.
Yeah, indeed. Many thanks to our panel. I want to thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.